record. There's one other thing I wanted to look through. So I don't think this stuff is on the playlist, um, but if you go through, this is the video channel, and hopefully you guys all subscribed. I didn't make a separate playlist for just like the homeworks, but you can kind of see. So here's like, can you guys see there's homework 6, 7, and 8, which are videos that are available. Can you guys see the YouTube playlist?
Yeah, we can.
Or I mean the videos. Yeah.
Yeah, we can
So
Yes.
yeah. So I guess if I had and then there's like, anyway, you can see there's a few more. So if, you know, there are things that we don't get a chance to talk about, and you want to look at the homework playlist, those things might help you, because I do the same thing, you know, with other classes that I've done with this one, which is, you know, I could go through the homework stuff. So one of the things that somebody pointed out is, so we started to get to the part where there aren't as many questions on the practice as there are on the actual homework quiz. And again, that's by design. And the questions, if you're trying to look for like answer to these questions, and I'm not saying they're really easy, but the ones that are probably the most challenging are these ones that are like multiple choice questions, like kind of down at the bottom. And if you're looking for like, and I guess there's some a little bit in the middle too. If you're looking for like, okay, so how do like I begin to answer those questions? Well, that's book and lecture, but I can point you to a particular lecture, and I'll go back to the YouTube, and now I'll go to the playlist. And remember, lecture wise, we're in this supply and demand part 1, and oh, that's the wrong one. Hold on, that's for the upper division class. So principles part 1, supply and demand. Okay, we're in this part right here, and you see this lecture at the very beginning, which is the first one, principles of demand and supply, and it's got the PowerPoints. Okay, so that one is the lecture that covers the shifts in demand and supply and what causes shifts. Okay, so you have to kind of think, you know, take good notes about what shifts demand and supply, and then when you go down to these questions and it asks things like, so here's the demand and supply, and look, for example, so this one, there's demand, and then there's the shift in demand, and you can see it's a leftward shift, or it's a reduction in demand. And then it asks you about things like, well, could it be a decrease in income if the good is normal? That's the, you know, number 1. And the second one is, you know, an increase in consumer income if the good is inferior, and that sort of thing. Then you can go through those cases, because we talk about normal and inferior goods in the lecture, and you can you know, figure out which cases apply. So okay, okay, I think that's a good help on those types of questions, but it requires a little bit more work, and you got to be a little bit more careful before you go to those questions. And then remember, as long as you don't actually answer a question, like you could go through and answer these other ones, but if you've not answered the multiple choice questions, then Ignithium hasn't recorded anything. It's no big deal. You can log out or refresh the page to get like a different version, but the multiple choice questions should stay the same. So it's not gonna like switch the answer order or anything around on you. So then you can go back and look at your notes and think about it pretty carefully. So
I was
go ahead.
wondering for number 10, this might be a specific question for like when you do office hours, but I feel like that question's pretty vague.
Okay,
Like
so let's take a
multiple
look.
answers, without a doubt, you could reason do shift the demand that way. You know what I
Okay, so
mean?
let's look at number 10. That's fine. Okay, so consider the shift in the demand illustrated, right? So that's a rightward shift. That's an increase in demand, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so this is a little more applied, right? So so the graph illustrates the demand in Los Angeles starting the year 2020 and projected to 2050. What's the most likely cause of the shift of the demand depicted during this time period? So let's not even look at the answers for a minute. Okay.
It's just there's two answers that both could.
Well, let's just say so there's been an increase in demand for water from 2020 to 2050, right?
Yes, people are willing
Yeah,
to pay more for water.
right, and that's fine. That's one way of thinking about it. But I would encourage you to note that at each and every price, right, the quantity demanded is greater than before, right? That's how we normally talk about rightward shifts, right, Mitchell?
Yeah.
Right. So if you didn't even look at any of these answers, right, and I was just talking to you, why do you think um, that people would, given the same price, right? Why do you think there would be a greater quantity of water used in Los Angeles in the future?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I think I know which one's the right answer. Now I don't want to say it out loud. Just yeah.
You
I don't know.
know, it's totally okay. Go ahead. Let's talk about it.
Well, to be an
Fine.
increase in population would be
Yeah.
an increase demand more.
Yeah, and so that's generally the case. Is that yeah? We anticipate there's an increase in population for lots of reasons. I mean, one of the things is that population's been growing over time in the United States generally, right? But
Yeah.
in addition to that, there's also been this trend that populations have become more urbanized. It's really an incredible sort of story, and I don't know if you have anybody like this that you know of personally in your family, but both of my sets of grandparents grew up on farms,
Yeah.
and it used to be like, let's say 100 years ago, 1920, right? That about a third of the US population was involved in the production of agricultural commodities. So, my grandfather on my dad's side raised beef cattle, and I don't even know what they did on the farm on my mom's side. They just lived on a farm. I don't know if they were just feeding themselves or they're actually trying to sell stuff. But these days, the industrialization of agriculture means that, and it's funny, but Cal Poly is one of the few universities in the CSU system, probably, out of a relatively small number in the whole country now, that still has an active ag program. And every year, the agricultural program at our university struggles with having enough students enrolled, because the demand for workers in those fields is just tiny. So I don't remember the most recent. It was at one time easy to say we went from 30% 100 years ago down to 3% of the population working in agriculture. But I think now that it's even less than that. It may be like 1.5% of workers. So there's been this real trend in urbanization, and cities have grown while our population has grown. So yeah, population is a big deal. So what were the other ones that you thought looked interesting to you?
A new water supply infrastructure project kind of looked
Okay.
interesting, but I realized now after putting more thought that would shift the supply
Yeah.
line. It has to be funded somehow. So that's where my mind was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. So it literally
but that's
says,
a
right,
supply shift.
water supply, right? And then did you get tempted at all by this increase in the use of drought tolerant plants? Because that's been a trend too.
I mean, I kind of got tempted by it because people have a tendency to overwater those, but I didn't think the question got that complicated.
Well, yeah, but also if I have drought tolerant plants in my backyard, and am I going to use more water as a water consumer or
It's
less?
actually been it's I'm from Northern California, and we had to go through a not rationing, but a whatever it's called. We had to use less water forcefully. We could only water on certain days a week. And it was actually funny. A certain study was done, and it was like nearly 30% of people overwater all their plants.
Oh yeah. But
So
like
it's
I don't know.
simple. A lot of people do overwater cactuses in general, like almost everybody who has a cactus does. So it's like that actually could increase the demand. People are trying to take care of the cactus.
Okay, yeah. I think you're kind of
get too
going
complicated.
giving it a different direction. But yeah, in fact, we know that drought tolerant plants need less water, right? And so assuming that consumers were behaving rationally, which we always do in economic models. So this may be and I would say in all economic models in mainstream economics, there's some research being done right now into what they call behavioral economics, which captures some of the mistakes and other things that people do make. But in mainstream economics, we focus on people who make rational decisions, and a rational person would water a plant that requires less water less. So, so that would actually be a decrease in demand, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think you can, through process of elimination and thinking about the question, even though it's applied, you can kind of sort through the options. But it is important to point out that there should be nothing tricky in the reasoning. So I'm glad you brought up like your experience with people over watering and stuff like that, only because I'm not saying our economic models are always correct, but we always assume that the people in the economic situation are behaving rationally, which means they act the way that they should act. So that might help a little bit too. And it's something that probably you skipped past when you were reading the introductory chapters, or you're talking, listening to the very first videos where we're kind of like, this is econ and this is what we do. I think I talk a little bit about rationality, but I know it's in your book. But because this is a principles class, we kind of keep it, short and simple. But it's important to realize that yeah, if you ever get tempted of thinking that people are acting in a way that is like driven by emotion or something that people would readily identify as being an irrational response, it won't be an answer to any of the questions that you see in this class.
Okay, so I don't have to worry about a toilet paper hoarding rationality.
No. You don't have to worry about people doing weird stuff. That will never be the right answer. And in fact, you know, I sometimes tell students there is kind of a theme to this first part of the class, which is, markets are good, 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 and the government is bad, bad, bad. So, and I say it's a theme because actually, like in the second half of the class, we come back and we say, well, there is actually an appropriate and potentially beneficial role for governments in regulating markets in certain conditions, but that comes at the end of the class. The first class part of the class is just, the markets always get it right, and there's never any issue. One thing, this is kind of as an aside, I'll point out, this is like one of those questions where like I might refresh the page because the graph looks scrunched. And I just want to point out to you guys, you can do that. I'm not sure it's going to look any better now, but let's go back down. So we were at 7. Yeah, I think that one maybe looks a little bit better, but here even maybe the points are too close together. So
yeah, I'll say that messed me up. On one, it actually doesn't give you the new equilibrium point at all. So you really have to be certain that that line crosses where you think it does.
Yeah. And so like this one's better, right, than what I just had up there for number 7. So if you can't see things clearly, then refresh the page. And again, as long as you haven't answered the question, nothing's held against you. You're perfectly fine to do that. So Austin had a question, but he answered it in chat. I don't know, Austin, did you have a mic this morning?
Yeah.
Did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, well, actually I have 2 questions, but in quiz 5,
okay, you want me to pull it up?
Some of the, yeah, sure. So some of the P low questions had their demand in the negatives, and for some of them I answered
like
them
this one
as if the demand was 0.
Yeah. So
like
like this one. See, now, you know what I would do with this, right?
No.
I would refresh it, right? If I get a question like this, so this is number 3, right? And the graph looked goofy to me. So now number 3 looks more normal, right? Do you see? Are you with me or no?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
if you, yeah, I am. I mean, if you keep scrolling down, you're probably gonna find one that's like still
Oh
wrong.
yeah, but I'm fine,
but
right?
at any
Because
rate,
if I answered 3 and then I get to 4 and then I go, oh gosh, like 5 looks bad. Well, I haven't answered 5, right? So I just refresh it until I get. I just have to pay attention. Like, see, I already answered 4, and now I'm down to 5. Okay, 5 looks better now. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like you have to worry about the instance of all of the questions looking good. Well, all you have to do is worry about the instance of the one you're going to answer. You know what I mean?
okay.
So that's
so
what
for some of these questions, I should just refresh until I get a correct one.
Yeah, and for the particular question, just and again, on the quiz, you can see if you're ever like worried, right? If you go under my grades and you look at the details, you can see the ones that have been recorded. And as long as it hasn't been recorded, you're free to refresh and refresh and refresh until you get one that looks good. And for I guess is this quiz 5? Yeah. So and these graphs on quiz 5 are probably the ones that are kind of like the worst for it. You can see a lot of them end up goofy. And I'm not saying that you know, yeah, so before I would answer them, I would just refresh until I got something that looked decent. And like probably even like this one, I would play around with only because it's like, it's so hard to see, you know? So I just wouldn't answer it unless, you know, I
So you can
refreshed a couple more
refresh
times.
as long as you don't answer, Professor?
Yeah, right. It's for the particular question. And that's what you guys should play around with is, you know, I give you like my little tips and tricks for how to, you know, let's call them legitimately make your life easier. And the best one is, you know, if I was doing this and I was, you know, looking at, you know, these types of questions, this lecture has to do with like price ceilings and price floors. That's kind of like the area. If you look in the book or you look in the lectures, you're going to see standard graphs for those topics, for excess demand and excess supply. And if Ignithium gave me a question on a quiz, I would look at the book and put the book like right next to my graph, and I would refresh until I got one that looked like the graph in the book. And then I would answer it. But I wouldn't, you know, answer one that looks bad. And like I said, as long as all of your other answers are saved, if you answer, you know, number 1, 2, 3, and then you are number 1 and 2, and you get down to number 3, and you're like, this one I don't like it. It looks goofy. Then, you know, I would refresh until I got one that I liked. Yeah.
The problem here is, like, I'm sure a lot of people like me answered these questions as if the correct answer, I mean, we were supposed to measure the demand as 0 instead of a negative number. And it seems to me that there should be like 2 correct answers here, but that doesn't seem to be the case in the Ignithium database or whatever they have there.
Yeah. And it's not. And that's why you have to kind of use some discernment when you do that. The only thing that I would say, Austin, is that, you know, if I go back to, and like why, you know, like if you ask me like, well, how is it fair, right? Well, it's fair because if I go back to the practice, right, I would encounter the same problem like I had showed you guys before. And if I know my answer's not matching up, because again, these, you know, like are randomly drawn graphs and some of them don't render well, then I can sort that out on the practice before I ever get to the homework quiz. So, you know, even though I'm sympathetic, you have the tools between the practice and the homework. And hopefully, you know, the other thing I guess I will put in context for you is that, you know, suppose you missed a few points on this one because of that. Well, again, that's not going to be damning to your grade. But if you don't get used to being careful, you can encounter other situations. And by careful, I mean like refreshing to get an example that you're comfortable with before you answer it. If you don't kind of learn that technique, then because the graphs are randomly generated, you're going to encounter things maybe in the exam or you know, later on in the course where it becomes a frequent issue. So I'm glad we addressed it now, and hopefully you're on board. But that's really important, is that, you know, that's why I tell you guys straight up front in my you know, tips and tricks for like how to do better in the course, is that you really only want to answer a version of the question, an instance that you understand and you're comfortable with, probably because maybe you worked with it on the practice or something similar on the practice, and you know, you've seen something like that in the book and you're comfortable with it. So I would say, you know, chalk it up to learning experience, but hopefully now you're, you know, calibrated so that won't be an issue going forward. Because
Okay.
you could, I mean, I don't remember last semester if I did or I didn't, but there could easily be one of these kinds of questions like on the final exam, and you would be in exactly the same situation. And if the graph rendered in a weird way, you know, part of the knowledge you're carrying with you is, you know, what these graphs and models look like. And so if something looks goofy, just don't answer it, you know, refresh and do something different.
Okay, so I have a second question, and it's
Yeah.
In the graphs with like a p high, right? Supposedly, like there's a certain amount of demand, and then but producers create, like, you know, many times more of that product
Yeah.
than is
Yeah.
actually demanded, right?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering what the real world like version of this looks like, because if the sell, I mean, if the
Okay.
producers know that only a certain amount of this thing can sell, it's hard for me to imagine them going like, okay, I'm gonna make like literally 5 times more of this thing than will actually sell.
Yeah. So you're talking about the excess supply thing, right? So like this
Yes.
type of situation. Yeah. And so this one, so here, 16.33 units and 40.9 units. And actually, we kind of talked about this a little bit last time. And there are a couple of different layers of the analysis. So technically speaking, when economists have modeled what we would call the dynamics, like how we move toward equilibrium, right? It's difficult to imagine, except for in a very mature market. You know, maybe something that people have been selling for hundreds of years, like wheat, right? That like the wheat farmers have a pretty good idea about how much wheat they can sell, right? But if you think about, you know, real world situations where you know, sellers are introducing new products and things like that, I mean, everybody hopes, right? They have demand projections, and they miss the mark. I don't know if you have any really good examples from your personal life. You know, if I was going to try to think of a real world example, do you remember Beanie Babies? Did you ever have any as a kid? Maybe
No.
after the Beanie Baby craze. Well, when my son was little, he's like 2.5 years old, these little stuffed animals called Beanie Babies were like really a big thing. And a lot of people describe Beanie Babies as being a bubble market, which means that you know, people were hoarding them and saving them like Bitcoin. But what happened is that the market got really saturated, and at kind of like the end of the whole Beanie Baby craze, people were throwing them out, and I was driving my son to the supermarket, and we saw a yard sign sale, and people literally had trash bags full of Beanie Babies, new with the tag still on, that they had like gotten for their kids, that they had no use for anymore, and they were just giving them away. So I guess the point is just that you know, sometimes, and so there were lots of Beanie Babies left over in inventory, and then they, you know, like it would end up at the equivalent of like Dollar General, or, you know, the dollar store, or Savers, or something like that. So suppliers don't always, you know, they might have a good, you know, price point for their product, and they might think, based on their demand projections, that they might think that they can sell that, but it's only once the demand is realized and they're with leftover inventory that, you know, then they begin to lower their price and recalibrate their demands, you know. But if you can ever think of like a product that you're familiar with that was a dud in the market, that nobody really wanted, then you know that, like, yeah, this type of thing does happen. And it tends to cause downward pressure on the price. But
So are we assuming that, sorry, are we assuming that the consumers are perfectly rational, but the sellers are not? I mean, the producers are not?
no. Well, actually, what you're kind of talking about is not rationality, but you're kind of talking about perfect information, right? So
Okay.
you're right. It would be irrational if, and we don't assume this. This is like one particular high price, right, where the producers overproduce, right, and then like the next round, right, there would be downward pressure on their price. The problem here is like that, probably where you're getting a little bit stuck is that we don't actually show, okay, what would happen in the next round of production or the next round of trade. We don't actually show, okay, so now the price decreases to this and the calibration gets better. What would be irrational, right, would be for sellers to be at this price and either continue to persist in producing too much and generating losses for themselves. That would be irrational. Or like even like trying to increase their price, right, from that, and doing worse. But yeah, the real heart of this kind of example is supposed to show us two things. One is that if the price isn't near the equilibrium price, then sellers are getting a signal that they can produce more, and they're gonna be in a situation where they have excess supply compared to what consumers want to purchase, and in particular that if the government has what we call a price floor, and this an example of the price floor, the one that I mentioned in lecture and is mentioned in your book, is the minimum wage, right? And in the minimum wage case, a lot of students have difficulty because you're actually a supplier in the labor market, right? You're selling your labor, and on the demand side are businesses. And so if the wage is set above the equilibrium wage by law, because there's a minimum wage that's what we call a binding minimum wage, it's higher than what employers would normally pay their employees, then you've got more people that want to work than there are businesses that want to hire. And that's what we call unemployment. So you can kind of see in one sense that the point is that if the price is fixed by law, whether the suppliers actually supply this quantity, like produce it, the point is that they would want to, right, if they could sell it. But so you're sending strange signals to the market. It's like the people who want to work at the higher wage, and let's right now they're debating the $15 minimum wage, and it's kind of difficult for us to relate in California because a lot of people already make that kind of money working. But you can imagine if, like, for example, our minimum wage is $50 an hour, right? There would be lots of people that want to supply their labor, but they wouldn't be able to find jobs, right? So there's still a mismatch between the quantity that suppliers want to supply and the amount that buyers want to purchase. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did I answer your question, or are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure, no problem. And let's see. So since you guys already had those other videos for the homeworks that I assigned, I'll go ahead and I'll just kind of stop there with respect to the specific questions, unless somebody, I don't know if somebody had a specific question, but if you did, we could talk about it, like we did with Mitchell. But if you don't have a specific question, then I'll stop the sharing and